So the consultation with researchers across UQ, from early to mid to mature career researchers, and with partners from industry and government, we refocused our 5 impact themes. We developed an impact outcome framework to guide our areas of focus as well as our investment, and also developed collaborative research initiatives to support making things happen, because it's all about making things happen in the implementation. And how to make it happen. So we were inspired by our consultations that I've spoken about having an approach that facilitated and coached researchers and external partners around the co-design into programs of work, of research. And hence the idea of the Research Impact Nexus was born through those consultations. Our people asked for it. The co-design approach is not unique to UQ, of course. It's a well-known approach. Many of our researchers, many of you in the room here that I've seen, are experts in using this approach in your own research endeavours around co-design and innovation processes. But what was clear from our consultation is that many are asking for more deliberate mechanisms that connect researchers and connect through to external partners, so that two-way kind of connection. It is this more deliberate approach for planning impact and impact pathways that sees us here to launch the Global Change Institute's Impact Nexus. So I'm looking forward to hearing the perspectives from our panel members. And so thanks very much for being so generous with sharing your time with us today. So to tell us more about GCI and the role of the Nexus, over to Professor Rachel Parker.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I want to start by saying that Global Change Institutes are a really different kind of research institutes, very different to the other research institutes at UQ in that we don't employ our own research workforce. So our purpose is actually to draw together discipline excellence from across our different faculties and institutes to address major challenges for society, for the economy, for environment, and for culture. And the Research Impact Nexus plays a critical role in that process because the Nexus is going to help upskill UQ researchers to do this kind of work across disciplines and with partners that we know we need to do in order to develop holistic approaches to solving some of our greatest challenges. So that's going to be a critical role for the Nexus moving forward, because as researchers, we are not always trained to work across disciplines. We are trained in often very narrow ways to build deep discipline-based excellence, which is really important, and much of the applied work that we do draws on decades of fundamental and basic research. But in order to do that cross-disciplinary collaborative work with partners, we need support in being able to deliver against that. And as researchers, many of us actually take on our academic careers because we want to make a difference in the world. And I think one of the reasons why we have almost 200 people online watching this event today is because there are many early career researchers who are motivated very strongly by the idea that the research that they do can make a difference to the world. And as a social scientist, I like to look back on what an American sociologist, Robert Gordon, describes as the Great Century from the 1870s to the 1970s. If you think about what science and technology contributed to the world during that period, it gave us railroads, it gave us motor cars, it gave us refrigeration, it gave us washing machines, it gave us immunization, antibiotics, anesthetics, clean water, sewage systems, postal systems, televisions, radios. These fundamental transformations had a huge impact on human society. And it sat along new ways of organizing our society and organizing our polity. So social ideas made a massive contribution during this period as well. It gave us the welfare state, it gave us pensions, gave us the living wage. All of these scientific, technological, and social innovations massively improved productivity, greatly extended our life expectancy, improved our standards of living, and greatly reduced our working hours at a pace never seen before in human history. And it's science, technology, and social ideas that made that contribution. And now human society faces massive global challenges: climate change, the need for clean water and new energy sources, obesity, inequality, pandemics. These are global challenges that require new ideas and new ways of thinking. And universities and research will be at the core of solving some of those challenges. What we're trying to do at GCI and through the Nexus is supporting UQ researchers to collaborate with each other and with partners so that we can chip away a little bit at some of those global challenges. And wouldn't it be fantastic to think that in 100 years' time, sociologists are writing about the next 100 years as a special century where we solved some of these problems that are facing us and facing humanity now, and I think is the motivation for many of us being in the room today. So, not a large task to hand over to our Dr Crighton Nichols, who is the manager of the Research Impact Nexus at the Global Change Institute. And Crichton's playing a cool role in unpacking the program of work that we will run through the Nexus that will support UQ researchers to maximise the value that our research can create for the world.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Bron. They were really wonderful opening remarks to help sort of set the context of today's panel discussion. Before we begin, I too would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Yeah, so as you heard, my name is Crighton Nichols. I'm running the Research Impact Nexus at GCI. And in a nutshell, it's about co-designing impactful research. So in order to understand that, we've basically invited some of the best people we know at the university to come and share their experiences with us here today. For those of you who don't know them, I'll give some very quick introductory remarks. So first we have Hugh Possingham. Hugh is the Queensland Chief Scientist and Professor of Mathematics and Conservation Science at UQ. He has over 685 refereed research papers, 89 fabulous PhD students supervised, and over $80 million in competitive grants. Not bad. His goal is to preserve as much biodiversity as possible. So thank you for doing that.
I'm not doing very well.
We also have Laurie here, Laurie Buys. Laurie is a professor and director of the Healthy Aging Initiative, professor in the Health and Behavioural Sciences faculty, and former national president of the Australian Association of Gerontology. I hope I said that correctly. Laurie believes that transdisciplinary approaches to addressing challenges lead to more sustainable outcomes. So thank you for joining us. Next, we have Andrew Alf Garnett. Andrew is the director of the UQ Centre for Natural Gas in the Faculty of Engineering, Architecture and IT, and is a former Shell and Schlumberger executive. He currently leads large multidisciplinary research programs contributing to future energy transitions through natural gas and carbon abatement at UQ. Great, thank you. And finally, Cristyn Meath. Cristyn is a research fellow with the Australian Institute for Business and Economics at the Faculty of Business, Economics and Law, and co-founder and co-lead of the Infrastructure CoLab. Previously, Cristyn has worked in the private, not-for-profit and government sectors in a wide variety of roles. So thank you also for joining us. Right, we're now going to get rid of this podium. So where shall we start? Alf. Yes. Well, I will start with you, Alf, if you don't mind. The whole idea of co-designing impactful research where you get large groups of diverse stakeholders together to figure out how to solve these challenges together. I mean, it's something that isn't easy. Anyone who's tried it knows there are challenges. So I'd like to start with, why do you do it?
So the first thing to do is make sure you have a wide enough perspective on what the challenges actually are, even before you're talking about research design. And that certainly doesn't sit in a university. Right. It sits out in industry, it sits in government, it sits with communities in our case as well. And so even before you figure out what you're trying to figure out, it's really an engagement. So that's the big why, is so that you know it's going to be relevant and impactful in the context that everybody else is sitting in, not just the ivory tower.
So you basically know that you're solving the right challenges.
Correct. Yeah, and you've got a similar perspective on what those challenges are to a number of other people in the room.
So everyone's on the same page.
Well, as much as possible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Cristyn, what are your thoughts? Why do you do it?
I would agree with the level of insanity, certain level of insanity, definitely that comment. I guess, you know, within the academic system, I would say as an academic, I'm not driven by theory as much as I love it. I'm really driven to solve problems. That's why I left industry and government to come to the university in the first place. And as Alf said, I mean, I just find it necessity. There's fantastic research that can be done without co-designing with other stakeholders, but I'm a corporate sustainability scholar, so I really find that, you know, I need to work with people from different disciplines, whether that's within the business school itself or the Bell faculty or other parts of the university, and definitely, you know, external stakeholders, so government and industry and not-for-profit, in order to be able to try and solve the problems that I'm looking and working on. And also it's fun, it can be really fun. It can be very challenging, of course, but you also, you know, if you are working with other stakeholders, then you can have incredibly unexpected outcomes because you're working with people who have completely different knowledge sets to you. So obviously, you know, there will be things that come through that process that you never would have thought of before. By combining forces with people with different skill sets, capabilities, different networks, you know, you can quite quickly have some fantastic outcomes that simply wouldn't be possible if you're working on your own. So there's a few different aspects there. Yeah. There
is. Thank you very much. I like that idea of the diversity of the stakeholders can sometimes lead to unexpected solutions, and
yeah, and I
really
think it
makes it more fun too.
Yeah, and especially if, you know, if you're working with the end users as well, then you're being validated along the process, so you know you're heading in the right direction. If as a, you know, combined group you come up with something that is at all, you know, commercially or strategically beneficial for the solution you're trying to solve, you don't need to feel like you've got this knowledge and you're sitting inside the university waiting for someone to find out about it, because if you are working with industry, they will just implement it immediately. They won't wait around because that's what they do. So yeah, it's another.
That's what you want, translation immediately.
In terms of impact, then it's there. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Hugh, why do you do it? You could do anything. So why do you do this?
Good question, and thanks Bronwyn and Rachel for getting this all together. I think this is a great plan, and Crichton for organising us an important discussion to have. I like the other speakers' thoughts. I mean, the real question is, why wouldn't you do it? I mean, in some senses, why wouldn't you want to have impact? So, as I often say, I mean, maths and science has paid my salary, but I get out of bed because I love nature. I love nature, I want to do something. So it's always been on my agenda. I would have to say that I'm completely incompetent at co-design. So I have no idea what I'm doing. I had no mentors and role models. I started in a maths department where actually there was a good telecommunications group working with Telstra early on, but I didn't have much to do with them. I did what an early career academic does, you know, you write grants, you write papers, you have PhD students, and then, but I had this other life in the nature conservation world where I wrote angry letters to government and I met ministers and sat on advisory committees, and the two actually slowly came together. So it was my two lives that came together, and then I realised that being an academic at a university wasn't entirely useless, and occasionally people listen to you, even in Australia, the intellectual capital of the planet. They do listen to you, and there are people in politics and the public service who have respect for knowledge, technical knowledge and scientific and mathematical knowledge. Found it very, very useful. And I would say, if anything, one tip I would have was probably don't listen. I spent 30 years of not listening to other academics who told me every time I joined a government committee I was wasting my time. And that's what they routinely said. Every time I spoke up in the media, I had phone calls from other academics and CSIRO people saying, Hugh, you shouldn't speak publicly about scientific issues. You've ruined your academic career. So I had a lot of counter advice from unwanted mentorship, and I was stupid enough to ignore it all. and continue to ruin my career. Bottom line is, that's what we need. This forum's all about, is making sure that every now and then those people who are pursuing applied outcomes, which does take a lot of time. And my co-development was through accidental development, co-development through government committees, where I started to learn what their problems were and get a lot of ideas from them. I mean, in the end, of those 691 papers, 80% have been inspired by my interactions with practitioners. So there you go. I would not have had the academic career I've had without talking to the practitioners, big NGOs, global NGOs, governments all around the world, telling me what their problems were, because they're the ideas. It's the invention of the problem, and then my attempts to formulate and solve those problems that have built my entire career. So in the end, despite all the advice from other academics, it was stupid advice.
Well, we're all very glad that you ignored it.
Yes. You should ignore all old white men, which is a funny thing to say, as an old white man.
So ignore everything Hugh said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Laurie.
I want to talk a little bit about insanity, because that's kind of what drove me to do co-design. I was a disciplinary researcher at another university, and I did that for quite a few years. And as an evaluator for grants and also as a reviewer for publications, I was seeing the same disciplinary stuff coming up over and over and over, and they were basically saying the same things, and the grants were asking for the same things, and it was making me crazy. And I was thinking, why are we doing the same thing over and over? And isn't the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? Everyone was talking about the problem of the aging population bit, and they still are, but we're doing the same thing over and over. So I thought, well, to get out of that insanity, take a really completely different approach. And the different approach was to go and bring people from completely different disciplines together to talk. And it's a bit what you're talking about, Alf, is that you bring people with completely different perspectives together, and you get a completely different understanding of that really complex problem. And so if you want change and you want things to be different and like have different perspectives, it's the only way to do it, is to bring people who are not normal bedfellows together. Because it's interesting when you talk about longevity, in terms of that topic, it ranges from the mining companies through to aged care. Now, and if you put mining companies and aged care in the same room, magic happens, because they've actually got a number of the same issues that they're facing, particularly around employment and so forth. And so it's actually exciting to see change happen. And as Crystal said, that's when industry takes it up and actually does something with it. So in my world, I was tired of just writing papers and just, not having a lot of outcomes. I wanted action. And so the only way to get action is to get industry and different disciplines together, and magic happens.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So some pretty common themes there. It's about harnessing all the diversity of those stakeholders to understand the problems in the first place, and then coming up with really creative solutions together. I get a sense that when you do this, sometimes there's unexpected outcomes and the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. So there's a lot of good reasons as to why people should do it. And of course, there are a lot of people at UQ who do it. And so ideally, we'd like to make it a bit easier for people who are interested in this kind of research to be able to do it and not face the same challenges that Hugh did when he was trying 30 years ago and getting told not to do it. So that'd be great if we could achieve something along those lines. Now that we've heard about why we do it, let's hear a little bit about what it actually looks like. And we've got people with very different backgrounds here on the stage. So hopefully we'll get some very different perspectives on what it actually looks like in different contexts. So Alf, do you mind leading again and telling us what co-designing impactful research looks like in your context, in your world?
Yeah, and it is worth pointing out we're coming from different spaces. So I have a long career in a particular sector internationally, actually, in very many roles, ranging from technical to commercial to even regulatory advisory roles. And so I sort of come at it from a very different perspective than many others, right? So that's sort of a leg up I've got in terms of engagement, because this is the odd environment for me, not the broader world. And this is a really odd environment, by the way, which we can probably dig into another time. But So how do you go about it? There's a wonderful mixture of three things. One, we've got some structured engagement processes. The other is a much more an informal, get out there and get your face seen and volunteer for stuff. And then the third one, which you won't like, is blind luck. I won't do too much about blind luck, but on the first side, on the structural side, we have a series of advisory boards at various levels of corporations and government, and particularly state government, where we regularly, in a structured way, meet around those longer term challenges. So we actually try to discuss those bigger issues. So that would come all the way from, if you like, some of the more engineering-y stuff, which is actually the easier stuff to develop, actually, to much more of the societal stuff, and particularly at the moment around energy transition. There's a whole load of reality versus rhetoric dissonance, and it's very difficult at the moment to dig out what the hell's going on. But we have a particular board level series of meetings for that. And that tends to be backed up by one-on-one meetings with myself on the informal sense, going into VPs or CEOs' offices and figure out what's going on. I have a colleague, Kathy Witt, who's out there in the communities a lot more than I am, so she's got that sort of contact. And so that's a sort of fairly structured way to sort of figure out, at least thematically, where those major challenges are, and to figure out what other people's perspectives of those are. And it's really going about who are ultimately the end users for this, which for us is government, industry, or community, sometimes all three. So that's structured, and then the informal bit is really, and you said, how do you make it easy for people? There is no way to make it easy for people. You spend a lot of time out and about volunteering for stuff. And actually, I would suggest trying to be a service provider. So a lot less me, a lot less what I want to do is, and a lot more how can I help you, which is a different way of engaging than the traditional, what you was describing earlier, of writing your papers and grants for me. This is much more about getting out there and figuring out if you can help in that world. And if you can't, by the way, step back and don't try to be a hammer looking for a nail. So some structured and some unstructured, and it's busy. And it's particularly busy if if you're trying to run stuff back at UQ as well. It's particularly busy trying to deal with that workload. But you have to sort of prioritize the external face over the internal compliance, I'd say.
Thank you. Bree, yeah, certainly it's a complicated picture, and you've got to manage many different parts.
Yeah, I should have just said it's just really easy, shouldn't I? just get out there and get on with it. Yeah.
But I think as once you start doing it, I guess that experience helps.
Yeah, there's something about the mentality of a service provider or a service leader where you're basically genuinely interested in what the issues are. And if it's not you or your group, then you say, oh, you should talk to this person either in UQ or other. You're just trying to help, right? That's a sort of, well, at least that's what we try to do anyway. Okay,
cool. Yeah, I like that service mentality mindset. Thank you. So, Cristyn, what does this whole co-designing impactful research look like in your world?
Yeah, it's probably some similarities with Alf, but I thought I'd just very briefly outline a couple of projects so that people can see from the project level. One is, I guess, the challenge or problem came about via Twitter by my international academic colleagues saying that they were waiting for the first conference to offer a virtual conference stream, which had been called for many years. Obviously, this was pre-COVID. And I was on the executive committee for one of these international research groups, and we ran conferences. There was someone in my my research group here at UQ who knew a bit about technology, and I just started some conversations with people to see, based on my understandings of conferences and the technology knowledge and the research group that I was on, what kind of ideas we had and what kind of will there might be to try something. And it turned out that there was a lot of interest in it. The next conference we were running was Sustainability in the Digital Age. So obviously it fit perfectly. We managed to get approval for a pilot study. So that would be with end users effectively, the conference organisers. We found a grant through my faculty, the Business, Economics and Law faculty, that was specifically designed to support transdisciplinary research projects and industry with industry partners. And so we just, we pulled together whatever we could, just a small group of us. We managed to get, I think it was only $13,500, so, not significant amounts of money. We did bring in someone from industry for a bit of technical support for that. in the end, then COVID hit. So unfortunately, we still don't have the data I needed for the academic paper that we wanted. But the study informed the conference organisers to turn the conference completely virtual because they'd been working with us on what we would do for a virtual reality conference. So it's very different to Zoom, but it still informed that. We wrote up a paper that got into Nature in the careers column, and it's the top 5% of research outputs measured by altmetrics. So it's fantastic. I managed to get the University of Queensland's name written in there early up too. So we got some good outcomes for the university. But then we kept pursuing, even though we were still trying to get this data, which we still haven't managed to get, because you're trying to balance the academic outcomes that you need with just trying to solve the problem for the end users. In the end, the person from industry who was working with us actually mentioned it to a friend in Europe who runs the Circular Fashion Summit at the Paris Fashion Show each year. And loved the idea and just said, let's do it. And so he ran all the models that we did, even some of the ones that we couldn't actually implement at the time because of other issues with COVID. And it was promoted in Forbes and Vogue Italy and all these different, fantastic things. They had a French university kind of get involved and all buy VR headsets. So again, it's that idea of if the end users or industry are involved, they will run with it straight away. Even the conference organisers use some of the insights from the study to develop a platform for virtual conferencing, which has been used by more than 50 academic conferences. So even though we were trying to solve a specific problem for academics, but even in doing so, we've then had impact beyond the academic area as well. Timing it's good for the need for it, but not good for our academic paper. And then the other one I'll quickly run through is the Infrastructure Collab, which is a collaboration established with industry. And that problem came about through the research that I'd done that just showed that there was this problem that individual companies might not be able to, get across some of the barriers that they were seeing around trying to improve sustainability in infrastructure, just because it was a system-wide issue. And I just went to industry events. I mentioned this issue and a potential solution. I talked to a few contacts I had in industry who I only met through doing research. I didn't have the really senior positions previously in that industry. I didn't know anyone in that industry before I started doing research in it. But it was, I think, the service mentality of just, this is what I found, is there a way that maybe this solution could work? We, through doing that, I guess, identified some different organisations who were really keen to be working in that space as well. We ran a workshop, looking at kind of identifying if where we were going was the right direction. We did actually change tack with that, and we really looked at the model we came up with in the end was really then drawing on the capabilities of each of the organisations. So an industry partner with a patented multi-party innovation model, the university then wrapping around that, evaluation studies, how we feed in research, how we have a knowledge exchange. And that's gone from strength to strength, and we have an incredible amount of support from industry and from government as well, state government in Queensland, and we that's turning into a bigger, probably the biggest research project of my entire career, but very unexpectedly, because it was more about trying to just communicate to people the findings of my initial research. So they're, very kind of different ways of getting there. Didn't really have any research funding for the Infrastructure Collab one for quite a while, but I think that's starting to change now. So
great, thank you for sharing those two examples. And in both cases, you mentioned previously as well this idea of unexpected outcomes. I mean, I'm pretty sure that you didn't have in your mind you would be influencing Paris Fashion Week when you were organising an academic conference.
No.
And you didn't expect that the Infrastructure Collab will take the form it currently has when you were just having a conversation around these issues. So the fact that you are open to seeing how these things evolve, and you got the right people in the room, as you said, sometimes these unexpected outcomes occur and they can be absolutely fantastic and beyond your wildest dreams. Yeah, so the VR project, I mean, we created a digital twin of this building for the conference, and we put it in a social virtual reality platform to host some workshops for the academic conference. This was with colleagues across the university too.
In Paris Fashion Week, they managed to get permission to use the Grand Palais. So they built a digital twin of that and put it inside.
Isn't as nice as this building, I might add.
No, but it looks pretty good. I went into it. There was an after party in there, so I was in my VR headset in Queensland, but participating in Paris Fashion Week. But it's just phenomenal, the kind of things that can happen. And still don't have an academic paper, but I'll be happy with the fact that we've created some impact. That's a pretty cool one. Yeah.
A very cool one. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah.
Hugh, I get a feeling you might have done one or two things that were reasonably impactful in your career. Would that be fair?
It could be, but I'm not going to talk about that.
Okay.
I will just say that I'm wearing a hat because my hair is not functional. It's only partially existent and is keeping the glare out of my eyes. I haven't given a talk in a hat before, just as an excuse.
I've got a hat, sunglasses, I've got sun cream, we're all slapping.
Here. I mean, the other speakers, I think examples are always good. We learn from stories and examples. I think turning up is first step. Be willing to share and volunteer, having a service orientation. They're all important things. Volunteering, they're incredibly important things that we're not necessarily trained to do and think about. I'm going to just tell one story that I'm just hoping will sort of piss a few people off. So let's try it. So I worked very closely with Senator Robert Hill, who was our longest standing ever federal environment minister, over 5 years. We worked on the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef, the EPBC Act, which is Australia's premier environmental legislation. And I chaired his inaugural biodiversity committee. And after several years of working with him and just getting stuff done, money out the door, acts and legislation created, and this is through the late 90s, he said to me, Hugh, you're odd for an academic. Academics generally really piss me off because I go to them and I say to them, what shall I do about this problem? And they almost all have one answer. They're the professor of X, Y, and Z. They're the world expert, how wonderful they are. And they say, well, Robert Hill, we don't really know, so could you please give me $10 million in 5 years and I will sort that one out for you?
Maybe.
Maybe, yes. And by then, of course, yes, politics will have changed and the question will have gone. And he said to me, Hugh, what are these professors doing? If they've been studying this topic for 20 years, why can't they answer any of my questions? So without inadvertently knowing this, and maybe just because I'm obnoxious, I would always give an answer to the question he asked me. So he'd say, should I allow this program for bringing in Asian elephants to Australian zoos? And I, being an opinionated, privileged, annoying person, would give an answer. And then I'd also say, well, actually, I actually don't know a lot about Asian elephants and zoos. So I think you should talk to Mary and Bob, and they're real experts. So basically, I'd then say, firstly, this is my best view, but maybe I don't really know what I'm doing. Talk to some of these other people. And then often I'd say, this has already been answered. The literature has this answer. So you don't need any research. It's all been done. So this actually led me later in life to study what we call value of information theory, which is what is the point of research? And we have written now dozens of papers showing that in many circumstances, gaining new data, gaining new knowledge, doing more research is a waste of time. It is suboptimal for the problem at hand. So people often say, we're going to build more protected areas in South Africa. We need to know where all the proteas are. And we prove time and time again, no, you don't. If you wait for 5 years to find out where all the proteas are, you will have lost half the habitat that you wanted to conserve and your options will be constrained. So value of information theory is a very honest assessment of what science is actually going to deliver an outcome above and beyond spending that time and money just doing more stuff. So why try and work out a new herbicide when you've already got 3 and they're doing a reasonable job? Why not just spend more money doing the stuff you're doing? So that is contentious. There's no doubt about it. And of course, some research spills over into other projects. So if you worked on that herbicide for this particular agency, that research could spill over to other places. But the value in that information lens, I think, is something that I'm trying to get the Queensland government to understand. I've worked now with protocols for the biggest NGOs around the world, is what research is worth paying for and what research is not worth paying for. Because what you get generally from academics is exactly what Alf said, is I'm a world expert on stochastic dynamic programming and Markov decision theory, which is, I think I am. Therefore, every problem you have is one of those problems. And could you give me more money to do that stuff? And this is part of the integrity and honesty, I think, of being an academic, is being able to say, you do not need me.
Thank you very much for that. That was very refreshing. I don't know if you pissed anyone off, but, you know.
Well, that's a failure then.
Give it another go soon, yeah. So Laurie, please share with us, what does co-designing impactful research look like in your world?
Well, I'm actually going to build on what Hugh said, because I absolutely agree with what you've said. And I think that for me, it's actually around the journey. The journey is incredibly important, and it's not a short-term journey. It's actually a long-term journey. And I learned that very early on in a previous life at a different university with a boss who's actually sitting in the room right now. She said to me, you know, if you want to change the world, you can't do it overnight, and don't expect to do it with one paper or one grant. And you need to bring people together, and you need to bring people together who are experts. You might be an expert, but you're not an expert in everything, which is exactly what you're talking about. So that boss named Bronwyn handed me a coffee card. It had 10 coffee cards that you could actually click on. And so I went out and talked to 10 people, took them to coffee. And the other advice given to me by some very astute colleagues were, stop talking and listen. And the advice was, if you've actually spoken more than 20% in that conversation, you've talked too much and you haven't listened. Because everyone you come across is actually an expert, and they're an expert in a whole range of things. And if you open your mind to it, then you can start to connect the experts. So that's the other thing that it looks like for me, is that it's connecting the experts, which is what you're talking about. So it's finding out who the experts are who can shed different light on that particular question. So yes, I might be an expert, but there's actually about 10 experts in here, and I'm writing down names and people I'm going to contact afterwards, because they can help me with my problem. And it's actually just reaching out and saying, this is a challenge, what do you think is the challenge? And getting people to then add in and listen and reshape the challenge over and over and over. Because every challenge has the journey. And what it might start out with at the beginning of the day is a different challenge as it is at the end of the day. And you have to be open to that challenge taking shape and understanding it. Because by the end of people pulling and tugging, and you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's the main thing. And being uncomfortable, meaning I don't understand it, or this is really hard. And your head might go away and hurt really because you just can't get your head around it. That means you're getting somewhere. And so truly bringing people together. So I always know that someone cares about a topic when they really challenge my thinking, or I challenge their thinking. We know we're going to get somewhere. So the journey for me is a long-term journey. It's a journey with people who really challenge each other's thinking and are comfortable with being uncomfortable. And also because they care about each other, actually, and they trust each other. And also it's about, really shaking it up and doing it differently.
Great, thank you very much. I'll attempt to give a very poor summary of that, so I'm very glad this has been recorded and we can watch the full thing afterwards. But it sounds like a service mindset's incredibly important, and I think we heard that from everybody. The journeys themselves are very long and unexpected. They take many different turns, but it's about recognizing the opportunities as they arise and engaging the right people so that those opportunities are more likely to arise as well. I think that the piece you made, the comment you made about the intellectual honesty, recognizing where you can add value, where you can't. So really understanding your strengths as a researcher, and being honest about that, and not being afraid to say, you know what, this is beyond me, and maybe I need to bring in some other people. I think that's a really important point as well. So there's some really fascinating insights here.
I could just add, I think I'd just add
Sure.
to Hugh's point, which is the bit about, I don't know how to do it, but I know somebody who does, sort of thing. And one of the things I probably should have said earlier, but when you're sitting here and you're out in the world and you've got UQ behind you, there's just this vast amount of stuff you can pull on. And actually one of the challenges is figuring out where the hell it is and what the hell it is. Is that right? Yeah. And so there's another element to it, which I probably should have said, which is you've got to sort of engage where the hell is the expertise sitting in your own organization, which is pretty damn hard to do actually. But almost always, not always, but almost always you'll find it at the size of our place, it's there somewhere. There's someone who knows something which is worthwhile bringing in. And that's a sort of challenging piece of that honesty piece. Because I'd still rather give the work to UQ than to somebody else, of course.
Good to hear. And actually, the final point I was going to make is that ties into this idea that respecting the different expertise that exists and the diverse ways of knowing, and they're not just academic perspectives, the actual lived experience. And
well, there's something about expertise which we tend to personalize it. It's a person, or it's a person's career path. And I actually think when you're in the complex problems, it's something that emerges out of the discussion. So expertise is much more of an emergent, in a complex system, right? It's much more of an emergent phenomena that comes out of the quality of inquiry and the quality of discussion and the right discipline expertise. It's a really complicated thing, this expertise phenomena.
And that's why we love doing it. So it makes it so much fun. Cool. The third prepared question I have for the panel members, we've heard now why they do it, what it looks like. If we could ask each of you to elaborate on how you do it. And I know you touched on some of this in your earlier answer, Alf, but is there any other sort of advice or recommendations in terms of how you go about doing this kind of research?
No, I haven't got much else to add other than I think Laurie mentioned it's the inquiry skills that you need to sort of develop. There's a big element of just getting off the advocacy bandwagon and just asking open questions and digging until you think you can understand it. So I probably said most of the rest of it.
That's a very good point. I mean, the art of inquiry is something that maybe isn't sometimes appreciated as much as it could be when you're really trying to understand a problem and how to ask the right questions.
Yeah, sort of genuine. There's a sort of curiosity needed, of course, anyway, but there's a genuine, you're really interested in it, then you just ask and keep asking, actually.
Yeah, great, thank you. So, Cristyn, how do you go about it?
Yeah, I'm probably similar to Alf in that there's not as much to add to what we've already gone through, but I would say there isn't one specific, way of going about co-designing, and it's really, I would say it has to be tailored to the specific problem that you're looking at. And, it's about that problem, about identifying the other stakeholders that are relevant, and working together with them. And then, and also just, part of it is chance. Like, is there a grant that happens to be there that is relevant for this type of project or this type of group of stakeholders that will support what you're doing? If there's not, then you're going to have to go a different way potentially. So there's I think it's very context specific, and having some of those skills around that art of inquiry and the service model and things like that, I guess, help guide the way you do it. But it's really, in terms of a specific pathway, I think the main thing would just be trying to tailor solutions to each specific problem that you're looking to address.
And there's always a need to sort of segment it into specific, you tend to move with a program of projects in a theme rather than, and then there's always a skill in itself of how you segment the thing up without creating silos.
Yeah, because complex problems, you can't solve them necessarily or address them or even understand them as a whole. You've got to look at sort of parts to it, but how you define those boundaries can be somewhat arbitrary.
And ensure cross-communication between teams and all the rest of that good
stuff.
As
you're doing that, you don't want to lose that holistic picture. So
beer and pizza is generally the way.
Beer and pizza.
Well, used to be the way anyway, before last year.
Now it's poke bowls and something else. Cool, thank you. Did have another comment there.
Well, while you're thinking of that, I just add, just going and talking to people in different fields. So from my point of view, finding industry events or government events that you can go to, to meet all those other people. So it's fine for us to sit up here and say, I'll go and find all these other interested stakeholders, but a lot of academics don't ever go to events that are not academic conferences or academic workshops. So trying to just find some of those, even if it's finding someone, you know, in a company or a website that, you know, government website you think might be relevant, and emailing them and saying, you know, interested in this topic that is relevant, would you have a coffee, have a chat? And you might get a no multiple times maybe. You know, it could be just calling on other people that you know, this is the type of topic I'm looking at working in. You don't have to say I want to co-design a solution or anything like that. It's a bit more about building some of those relationships and finding some of those people. And then when the time's right, you know, you might be able to bring those people together. So as that very initial stage.
Yeah, as you get to know people and they trust you, then they're likely to work with you.
Yeah.
I do remember what I was going to comment on was the idea that it is very different in different contexts.
Yeah.
And in my experiences working with some Indigenous communities, the process of co-design actually meant something completely different to what I thought it did. And it took me a while to understand even what co-design meant and how it was based on a different understanding of design. And so absolutely in every context, it's, well, what even does co-design mean in this context here for all these people? So every time, absolutely, it is different. So that's I'm glad you mentioned that point. Thank you. Hugh,
yes,
what would you like to add?
Two things. I'd just like to underline Cristyn's point of turning up and, you know, asking the questions. I'm very aware that here in Queensland, and coming from South Australia 21 years ago, where I want to have impact in is often in federal government, and they're in Canberra, and the people from Melbourne and Sydney are all over it. And we just seem to be a bit further away. We don't have those personal relationships. And so I spent a lot of time going to Canberra and opening those doors, beat down the doors of government departments in various ways. And I had multiple mechanisms for that. Sometimes it was an angry press release. Sometimes it was a polite email. And sometimes after the angry press release and lots of scuffling, they say, we've got to shut Hugh up. We'll put him on a committee. And then I was on the committee, and then I found out what their problems were. So, and I've done that with NGOs as well.
It'd be annoying.
But you can do, you know, good cop, bad cop with your friends. There's a whole way of starting a relationship with any organisation. It just takes energy and time. So I think that's an important thing. The other thing I think is then when you're in the table, when you're starting to have these conversations and find out how they operate, is how do I not be an obnoxious git? Yeah, I said obnoxious git. And that's not easy. Because they might talk to you about how they're, say, WWF International, or I'm in Washington talking to Conservation International, how they're prioritising all their conservation activities around the world. And as they're explaining that over various presentations, my eyes are opening. These people, they have no idea what they're doing. And if they'd just done basic first year maths and they could learn how to divide, not add, this would be so much better. But I don't say that. So how do you explain to a whole heap of organisations? And my thing is prioritisation. How do you choose how to allocate resources? And I could tell you 100 stories about how not-for-profits, governments and industry do a bit smarter on allocation of resources, have chosen appalling processes for allocating resources, wasting tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And the steam's coming out of my ears. So how do I contain myself and then gently make a path forward that isn't, you don't know what you're doing, how could you be doing this for the last 10 years? That's a challenge, and that's where I see many scientists and academics and specialists fall over because they're fuming. Haven't you read my 1977 paper on this topic? I can't believe it, and how could you? So that is learned for me over a long period of time and a lot of hard knocks, and probably still not quite there.
Are you able to summarise what you do say in that situation?
I'm, to be on now, quite Machiavellian and evil, and sorry, I should say this, but if I'm sitting in those sorts of committees, I do spend at least, if it's, say, it's an hour and a half meeting, I won't speak for at least an hour. Don't speak at all. Listen, and then when I think I've formulated an idea in my head, I reference at least 4 or 5 of the key people in the room, as Cristyn said, as Laurie said, blah, blah, blah. And then I actually say something which is what I think is right. It actually had no relation to what they said, that had a passing relationship to what they said, that makes them feel as though they've been heard, their voices are included, but without saying that actually what they said was actually not very good and was fairly much rubbish. And I say, this is the path forward. And then they feel as though they're part of the solution. And then we head off on that path forward. So it is, sorry, I should probably never have said that in public.
Well, it's not like it's been recorded and broadcast.
No, that's right. But
So
it's some sort of level of respect, and of course, often the information is very valuable. But you do need to bring everybody on board, because you only need one important person in that room, and you can't get a path forward. And they will stop you. And even if they don't stop you at that meeting, they'll stop you the next week or the month later in various processes.
So really, you need to get everybody on board.
You do, and I wish I had any natural skills in that space, but it's taken me a long time, hundreds of failures, literally.
Well, I don't imagine that's an easy thing for many people. And if anyone is an expert on that, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Laurie.
Hugh, again, I'm going to build on what you've just said, because I think that's really true. A couple of things that I've learned is that you have to have buy-in from everyone, and that actually takes time, and people need to express what they feel and they think. And I guess I always see my job as reframing that, which is what you're talking about, and bringing everyone together so that they can land on a particular way forward. But again, and you have to keep doing that multiple times, because people do have to buy into the process. And it also means we have to trust the process. So if we're going to co-design, we actually have to co-design and trust that process. So it means that people who are engaging in that process have the capacity and the ability to shape the outcome. So you can't co-design and have an outcome that you know you're going to get there's no point co-designing. Because if you're not open to allowing people to influence the process and let it go, and yes, you have to steer it and guide it, which is what you're talking about, is you steer and guide it. I feel sometimes like I'm a shepherd with a bunch of flock of sheep, and I'm constantly doing this, trying to keep them all going in one path, but you got to let them go how they want to go a little bit, because then you can ease them back in. The other thing is you've got to turn up. Absolutely, you have to turn up. That's number one. You have to turn up. I've organized a number of industry events, and I've invited researchers. I just did it the other day. Of the industry, 98% turned up on the day, and of the researchers, 20% turned up on the day that signed up. So again, UQ, we got to show up. So if you say you're going to do it, you got to do it. So if you say you're going to turn up, you turn up. And if you're going to deliver a report, you're going to work together, you've got to do that. So if you're going to co-design and you say you're going to listen and you're going to engage, you have to listen and you have to engage. So the other thing is that if you want to be a superstar, co-design is not for you. Co-design is about sharing, and it's also about sharing the jobs. So you have to be able to delegate and ask people to do jobs, because if they're asking and they agree to do the jobs, they're buying in as well. And then they've got skin in the game. So if you're doing a co-design, everyone has to actually have skin in the game, because otherwise you're not going to get your outcome that you want. And you'll have that person throwing bombs in to try and disrupt it. So skin in the game is really important. And the only way to have skin in the game is to ask people to engage and to do certain jobs and do certain things. That also means when you have success, it's shared success. So what's really cool is when you do win something or get something or achieve something, like we did it, and we did it together. And it's just so exciting because everyone shares the outcome. So if you're going to do co-design, it's a shared experience, a genuinely shared experience, and you've got to let that process play out.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah, I really like that idea of if you're going to, like the integrity you mentioned, if you say you're going to show up, show up. If you're going to do co-design, co-design. Don't have a goal in mind, because you're not really doing co-design if you already know where you're going. Like co-design is about the participants actually shaping the entire research agenda with you. So if you're not willing to let go and to let that happen, then you're probably not going to find this the right approach to doing the research. And yeah, it's not about the individual, it's about the whole. So that was some really great insights. Thank you. We're actually almost on time, which surprised me. So the last question I have is a very short one. I just want each of the panel members to share one tip for anyone who may be thinking of going down this journey to trying to co-design impactful research, change the world with their research. So what would your one tip be to anyone who's looking to get involved that maybe doesn't have a lot of experience with it?
We can't have show up because that's already gone, right?
If you've got something else, great. If not, we can just put that up there.
The only other thing is it's sort of an ironic one, really. It's particularly when you're engaging with industry on whatever level. It's ironically do the research on the company you're going to deal with before you show up, right? So get on Google and look the hell what they've been doing, because there's a large number that don't even do that.
It's a very good point. Be prepared. Excellent. Thank you. What would your one tip be, Cristyn?
I would say if you're really serious about it, try and identify some mentors beforehand. I didn't, but I found some along the way when I decided that they're probably useful. And they're good mentors, not the ones that Hugh was talking about, who will tell you, and they're still around. I've still been told that in the last few years of, don't do it, or don't do it unless it's going to bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars of grant money. So try and find the good mentors, people who you think have done something already and would be in the right type of situation to be able to help you when things get tough, because they will get tough at different times. Yeah.
Very good advice. Thank you.
Being a very sort of old school one, learn from your mistakes, but let me put a context around that, and the more mistakes the better, really, because then you learn faster. And I would say some sort of reflection that if the process doesn't play out as you see and nothing happens and it doesn't go anywhere, don't sit there, as is typical, of blaming everybody else and say they didn't do this because they're stupid and they're slow and they're incompetent. You should just think, well, what did I do? What did I do wrong? You should assume.
What can I learn from this?
You assume you didn't get where you wanted to get, then you should assume it is your mistake, and then you should try and work out what you need to do next time.
Excellent. Thank you. Humility is always a good thing.
Absolutely agree. Do your research on your companies, do your research on the people you're meeting with, get your mentors, pivot and self-reflection, and ask your boss for a coffee card. And use it.
Good idea.
And listen.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so that was the facilitated part of the discussion, and now it's basically a free-for-all for anybody who's attending here, either in person or online. The way we're going to run this is I'll see if there's questions in person, and then I'll ask one from the online people that are going to be sent to me via message. So I will be looking at my phone occasionally. It's not because I'm bored and checking my email. But if we can, could we start with a question from the audience in person here? Does anyone have a burning question for anyone or all of the panel? We have a couple down the front. Liz.
It's important you want to work with impact. How do you balance do you think the system should change in universities to value more impact when the people to go up the levels? Because I think at the moment it's not valued enough.
So would you say that's a question to do with the performance? Yeah, so please tell me if I got this right, but how do we make the university value impact more, especially when it comes to performance appraisals and people's careers? So how do we make sure that it's taken more seriously in that context? Is that what you're asking? Thank you. Who feels like having a go at that one?
Right. We were employed, a standard TNR academic at the University of Queensland is 40-40-20. 40% teaching, 40% research, and then there was 20% service. And I'm pretty sure, and maybe it's changed just recently, that service I noticed was all internal service. So yes, that is deeply disappointing. It's not the University of Queensland's fault, it's every university across Australia. I think now they're starting to realise that the service, like I typically would spend 40 full days a year on external voluntary service. That was never mentioned in any of my appraisals in my entire life. It did generate research funds indirectly and papers and ideas and students, but the initial service was never acknowledged or rewarded by any head of school I've ever had. So we could at least start off simply by saying that service includes external service, or making that number bigger, quite simply, or being explicit that of that 20% service or 30% service or maybe 40% service, half is external, being on boards and committees, and half and solving problems, and half is internal. At the moment, certainly, until I think it may have changed recently, it's been all seen as internal service. This is also a major problem. This is a major issue of re-education of deans and heads of schools.
So nothing too difficult to solve there?
Not at all, no. They're very viable, malleable people.
I mean, I have heard some people suggest there could be potentially different tracks for different types of researchers, such that you have the more traditional model, but then more impact-focused researchers.
And there is, I have mild anxiety about different tracks, and I think there's been an interesting discussion on the teaching focus versus the research focus. You have a service focus. There is a model for that. I mean, in the University of California land grant system, Berkeley, for example, has academics. One of my good friends, Adina Merrill-Lemlin, is one of them. And she is a research scientist, and she's an extension scientist, and she has a very limited teaching load. So she is directly in her contract at Berkeley, not that's a reasonable university last time I looked, rewarded for her impact in terms of extension, agricultural extension in this case, and environmental extension in the local region. And so that is a model that some land grant universities in the US use. So we could be more flexible. Joint appointments is my other favourite thing, but again, it's everything about making this every university more porous, and joint appointments, which we're pursuing more and more, offers some of the opportunities you're talking about. The trick is the promotion path at the end of the day. If it was all up to the head of school or the dean, they need to understand all the things that we're talking about here and now.
I think that's right about the service element. I think there's another thing. We have to be careful. It's not quite a dichotomy. It's not like it's either this or this. So there's a real honest conversation to be had within industry. I'm thinking about the researchers. They're just fabulous sort of academic researchers who work with the centre. And there's a really honest conversation with the company when you're doing research, which is, yes, we're doing this bit for you. And our value driver is the publications, for example. Now, that's a project management issue to a certain degree, because they always take too long and they come out too late, and But they have to recognize up front, there is a value driver about creating knowledge and publishing, which is why you do, one of the reasons you do work with university. Now, sometimes it's confidential, but generally speaking, for us, it's not been an issue. But you do have to be quite candid at the front that, yes, this is for us an important element. So there's a bit of mutual respect there. So it's not quite either or. There's certainly an overlap where you can make it work, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You're always going to have conflicting opinions, and that reflects one of the questions here about how you actually manage the conflicting.
Before you move on to that, I might actually build on that, because I do think
Sure.
You have to think about it a bit laterally, because it isn't one or the other. And what we've found with our industry partners is that they want, because you've got multiple audiences, and in our world, the service providers, our industry, need to influence government. And then government needs to, because they want to change what's happening, and then so you've got that partnership. And so we've talked a lot about what is it that we want to achieve together through that co-design. And industry often want to be on grants and they want to be part of that process. So again, you've got to co-design the grant so they believe in the grant and they participate. They also want the prestige, and they want to cuddle up to UQ. So they also want the journal articles to come out, but they also want some industry papers. So what we're trying to do is, with a journal article, also write an industry paper or something like The Conversation, so that you get the double-barreled with the same outcomes. So your grant leads to multiple outcomes for industry, but it's translated to industry outcomes, and then you can write about them in academic papers. They love it. Their board loves it. So again, it's about listening to what people really want, understanding the diversity of outcomes that you can have, and then plan for that. Because on a research team, you'll have researchers who are happy to write that side up. And then, in fact, we've had some industry partners write up the industry stuff that we can then put our name on. So you can actually get multiple publications when you give people different roles and you have different working teams. So you don't have to do it all yourself, but you can get better outcomes by engaging with other people.
And I might jump into, lead on from that one. As an early career academic, the issue I see is that, yes, it's fantastic. You can get, more outcomes. You can get the academic papers, the industry reports. The problem is, though, from early career academics is that everything takes so long, and we don't have very long when you're on contracts, when you're on recurring contracts. Yeah. So I think, I think it comes to the fact that obviously the university is supporting this. The university does value this, but that doesn't necessarily matter if your next contract, whoever is going to be hiring you, or the panel that's hiring you, either doesn't understand or doesn't acknowledge. There can be some deep-seated differences in what academics value and recognise. So if the people who happen to be hiring you for your next job don't really care about the fact that you've been working with industry partners for 2 years, and you will at some point get more benefits out of it, more strategic benefits for the university as well, potentially, that's a bit of a maybe a privilege for tenured TNRs in comparison to some of the early career academics. And that's a problem because there are so many early career academics who are in vulnerable, I would say, insecure job positions, who are very concerned about maintaining their jobs because they love what they do, but they also really do want to work with industry and government and solve some of these problems. So if there's a way that, and that probably filters down more to not just deans and heads of school, but also, all the other faculty who are on those panels. There are real outcomes that are negative for people because of other people on interview panels.
And to your point, I think there is no accident that most of the people who enjoy success in this applied area and impact are later in their career, when they're secure and they're tenured, and it's just a much easier thing. Yeah. Well, if they have a little bit of the space and the security to do those things.
So I've probably got more of the insanity that Alf was talking about in the first place doing it as an ECA, but...
You can say that, but I can't.
But again, if we want to mobilise, academic insights for co-designing and supporting transdisciplinary research and solving some of these problems, then that's something that, we might need to be tailoring the changes that we're making to make sure that the different types of positions and academics and their needs are built into that.
Sounds like a very important conversation that needs to be had around that whole space if we're going to be serious about impact, that especially for the early mid-career researchers. Yeah. Because it doesn't sound like that if you don't have that security, it's going to be very difficult to do this.
Yeah, it may be, it may not be, but it's hard, as I said. It just depends potentially who's going to be on the interview panel and what you're being hired for.
But those timing constraints are interesting as well, like in terms of, the co-design process does take a while. Like it can take a while to build up the relationships and the trust, to get one in the room, to figure out what we're doing and how we're going to go about it. And if you don't have the time to do that, then it will be a constraint that'll be a tricky one to manage.
And there's only so much time. You only have so much time as one person, even if you're working with other people. If you are trying to get the do the workshops, go to all the events, every conference that you go to, every event you go to, that's time when you could be writing a paper, or you could be sitting in an office on your own writing a paper. That wouldn't be as much fun, obviously, but all of those things are time costs. And then if at the end of the day you go back to your boss and they say, what have you been doing? Oh, I've gone to a whole lot of events, great. Or I've built up all these relationships, but what is the outcome? Is it a paper? Is it a grant?
How are you being measured?
Yeah, how are you being measured, and what is the next step? But I think the career pathways from that earlier stage as well, moving up. But again, we know that the university is really supportive of it. That's why we're all here. It's just making sure that that filters down to to support people to actually do it, whether it's the position allocations. I mean, 40 days a year of industry stuff and never having it valued once or recognised once. You're Hugh Possingham. That's what you do.
Yeah, but obviously some of those investments pay off over a longer period of time.
Yeah.
So that needs to be brought into it as well. So yeah, look, this sounds like a really complex challenge that maybe we'll need to get some people together and co-design a solution for at some point. But thank you, Liz. That was a great question. It really got people thinking and talking. So, and it does relate, if we're okay to move on? Yeah, sure. It does relate very much to this other question that we received online, which was around how do you navigate the conflicting perspectives on what is needed? So when you get a whole group of diverse stakeholders in a room, usually they'll have different agendas, different motivations, they'll want different things. So how do you manage all those different perspectives and try to create something where it's, you know, everyone's happy with that? So I'd love to hear your experiences doing that and any advice you've got for people who are in that situation. Does anyone feel like volunteering a suggestion?
I'll just say sometimes you can't.
Yeah.
Sometimes you, so, you know, getting people to reorganise and coalesce their value system, which is the objective part, is sometimes a road too far in that sense, and it's not necessarily the task of the researcher. So in those circumstances, I often retreat to a part of the issue that I feel as I can contribute to without, we're not there to corral civil society or industry into a vision of the way the world works, and they'll have to sort that out themselves to a certain extent. Yeah.
So if it doesn't appear possible, then possibly you look at, you know,
what could
going with a smaller group or a different group and reframing.
Subdivide the problem.
Subdivide. Okay. Yeah.
We use a real structured process with a lot of butcher's paper and post-it notes, and usually it takes 3 or 4 workshops, and it's not expecting people to, it's really interesting when you have a structured process, and I don't want to go into that right now because it would take a long time, but when you have it structured and people are allowed to work on other people's, you know, like work on different aspects of it and you contribute to it, it's amazing how things kind of bubble up to the top where there is some agreement. Not always, I agree with you, not always, but often you can at least agree on the challenge or a definition of the challenge or something. So what we try and do through a structured process, a navigated process over time is really try and get people to agree on at least a number of things, and then we work from there. But it does take time, and I think that that's something that the university does need to have a conversation around, is the time that it actually does take. But it's a more powerful outcome, but it does take time to do that because it is a structured process.
I understand one of your projects had over 80 partners, is that right?
91.
91.
Yeah, 91. And we held, at one point, we had to all agree on programs, we had to agree on projects, and we had to, it was developing a CRC application, and we held 25 workshops over time in the different programs, 25 workshops. Those workshops were attended by a huge, like a very high rate of the partners. We would have over 90 people, so in each of those workshops. So people were really, really contributing with online, which was very, very challenging too. But again, when people really do feel that they're being heard, and they can actually then, and you have to let the conversation go, you have to let people disagree with each other, as long as they're doing it respectfully. And then you know, as the facilitator, you have to facilitate, and as you said before, kind of move them into reframe it and so forth. But it takes time. And as I said, we had 25 workshops over 3 months online, and people came and participated. We did it over lunchtimes when people could come online, and yeah, they were there and they were engaged, and everyone ticked off on the outcome, and we ticked off on a really big application.
It's a fantastic outcome to achieve that. That's really impressive. So that's what's possible. Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else have any comments on?
No, I think just adding to Hugh's point, which I think is important. It's part of that context thing we discussed a while ago, understanding that broader, the context of the environment in which you sit. And there are environments where it's so contested You simply can't engage everyone. And you need to get that one. And some people don't want to engage anyway, and they don't, they think it's not a problem that needs to be solved, or they're just completely different value sets. You just need to get to that pretty early on in the piece. Otherwise, it can be quite destructive. But yeah, it's just not everybody's out there with a rosy view of the world.
Actually, I want to comment, that's absolutely true. And it's when people really do disagree, you'd have to say, well, okay, this is probably not your gig to be part of this. There's probably another gig that you're part of, but this isn't it. And I do think you have to set those boundaries. I agree with you, because if it's if you've got, 80% go in this direction, 20% go in this direction, then you've got to make some decisions about who's going forward.
I wonder
and they
if
have to self-select out.
I wonder if it's, if it's a big enough and important problem, it's contested. So it's probably usual that happens, I would think.
Yeah, I like that idea of self-selection as well. Quite often people will recognize maybe this isn't the right environment for me, and that option to
and to let them
else.
do it with dignity,
Sure.
so that they don't
Absolutely.
end up getting really angry because they, it's like, this isn't really for me. And then you go, yeah, you're probably right. And so that they, maybe next time they'll come back in and with a different framework. So yeah, it's kind of like not putting people in a position where they get really angry with you.
Absolutely.
Or the process, so that they can buy in later.
So one of the ground rules I found very useful is respect. And again, that's influenced through a lot of the work I've done with Indigenous communities, is that importance of respect for difference and diversity. And yeah, you do actually want to encourage different opinions, of course, but it's got to be done respectfully. And as soon as someone violates that, then that's usually a sign that, okay, this is not how we're going to work, and there have to be some ground rules around that kind of thing. So great, thank you. Yep, Bernadette, you've got your hand up very high there, so. Okay, thank you. Wow. I'll try and summarize that briefly. So civil society, the world is at risk unless we can develop a more inclusive we type leadership culture. And how do we establish that we leadership model within this university so that that's the default and that is the culture? Yeah, great. So yeah, not a big question at all.
I'm just going to look at my shoes and whistle while these guys answer it.
Well, we've got a bunch of leaders here on stage who are doing it. What would your suggestions be to help make this more the default as opposed to the exception, which it may be? I really can't comment, but that seems to be the case, that it's not as widely accepted and practiced here as it could be.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I'm reminded by Laurie's comments about the importance of workshops, which is getting people together to discuss issues. So my centres ran on hundreds of workshops, end users, government, practitioners, scientists in the room, and I can't remember since we had the resources to do that, 2005 to 2020. I think we had 10, 15 workshops a year. And many other people said, "What are you running so many workshops?" That's how we get stuff done. And so the key is making them inclusive, but we often didn't get the invite list right. And I would say the same is true for where I sit now in the state government. The state government is just not having enough, they are not facilitating discussions. So my favourite story that wins me no friends, even less.
Common theme here.
It is a very common theme, is the Environment Minister in South Australia, when I left, had 125 consultative and expert committees. The one Environment Minister in a state of 1 million people had 125 consultative committees, beekeeping committees, soil committees, parks committees. I was on about 5 of them, koala committees. And I got to Queensland.
Committees of committees?
Committees of committees, right, overviews. I got to Queensland, I think the Environment Minister has half a dozen. There's no criticism. This is the year 2000, and I don't think much has changed. So I think there is something certainly about the way governments in Australia have reduced engagement. I think it's variable from state government to local council, and it's variable from government to government. But my recommendation routinely is, if you want to co-develop and solve your problems, whether they're flying fox problems or whether there's water quality problems, you need to get everybody in the team. And I think that's where, the Global Change Institute, the university has started to show a growing leadership role, and we need to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. We will get resistance, because even now I recommend the consultative committees routinely, probably every month in my current job, and I get the eye roll, and it's all too difficult, it costs too much, tiring. It doesn't cost too much, it costs anything. In the long run, you save money. So to your point, I mean, it's a cultural issue, it's not something, and where does culture change from it? That has to be this university and the other universities in Queensland. We have to reform what is now not a very great cultural situation in terms of how we engage and discuss complicated problems. So yes, go for it. And I have to say, with all those workshops, routinely, of course, they became almost impossible to run, because my view is a good workshop, it is, now it's online, but a good workshop in the day where we were most productive, 3 or 4 full days, and there was dinner and there were drinks and there was pizza. And now I can't, the paperwork to do that is almost impossible. So we've sort of really gone off. I mean, and I know that those events sometimes can be exclusionary for some people, but it's the things that happen, like a conference, around the workshop. It's the side conversations that make the workshop work and make democracy happen. And yet again and again, I'm just saying to government committees, we have a committee on officers. I say, can we go for a drink afterwards? Can we have a chat? An informal, we've never done that before.
And we get to know each other as people.
That's right. Yeah, you can drink lemonade if you want to drink lemonade. That's fine. But please just have the one-on-one conversations, because half the people at a workshop can't feel they're not empowered to speak, and they have to actually communicate in the back side corridors. And there's ways you can do that in Zoom as well, I know. So anyway, yes. So
it is because it's a very difficult question. I mean, we're talking about cultural change, which is incredibly difficult. And as I say, the culture starts at the top. It's sort of set by the leaders, really. And if you don't have that that type of model of leadership from the top flowing downwards, it's going to be incredibly difficult. So, does anyone have any other?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So, how do you change the culture of something like university, and what is the right contingent leadership style? And it made me, as Hugh was talking and as you asked the question, it made me think, actually, I'm not actually sure we know what we want the culture to be. So there's generally arm waving, let's all get together and collaborate to the dare. But at the end of the day, you still have to press home, and you have to press home proposals, and you have to deliver results on time. So there is a time for one thing, and then there's a time to go a completely different leadership style that's drive, which generally is done at the project level. So I don't think it's quite so simple as just a collaborative discussion. It's much more about how do you balance that with the need to deliver, because one thing that will kill you more than anything is just not delivering. You get, and you see this in industry, like you get this death by engagement, death by collaboration. And so I actually don't know the answer, other than say it'd be worthwhile spending some thought time on what actually that culture looks like in quite some more detail, actually.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really difficult question. And it's one I think would be nice to have a good conversation around what does collaboration look like? What does industry engagement look like? How does that play out? How is it valued from ECRs through to professors? I think that, there needs to be kind of an informal and formal agreement about what that means and how we're going to really play it out, because it is challenging when you're working with industry and back home has a different view.
Yeah.
So it puts the researcher in a very difficult position. So, and it isn't all smooth sailing. I might sound a bit rosy, but it's not all smooth sailing. I have a stack of dark chocolate next to me when I need to have a little bit of time out, and I think you've got to have a team around you. But if we could have a conversation about that, would be fantastic, because it's hard.
And I might add to that from the perspective of the we that you were talking about, and in a we, often there is a project leader or a CI, but to have the we, you need to have other people who are not CIs, and what value is placed on them and their role. If they go for promotion and they say, oh, I was on these projects, but they weren't the CI, does anyone put value on that? Because otherwise we won't have any teams within UQ. It's not all going to be a hierarchy. It's not all going to be one person who brings in a lot of money and employs people if we want to bring together other experts. And maybe, again, that's more from the ECA's point of view of making sure you can prove that you deserve the next contract or a tenured position or a promotion. Maybe it's more amplified at that level. I also think it's incredibly difficult in academia because you're kind of trained to be the best in the world at what you do, not just better than other universities, but better than everyone else in your university. There is still some competition there. So again, how are you then saying to people, come together, maybe you'll be CI, maybe you won't. If there's any success, it's not necessarily your success, it's shared because it was created, it was co-created. So I think there are some challenges in how that's not going to change as academics, but then how we, I guess, incentivize and support individual academics to be the best in the world at whatever it is they're doing, and also see some value in collaborating and being the we, which is exactly where we need to get to. And again, that's just universities, that's just academia, not just UQ. Maybe some universities have got a different culture that finds a balance, but especially I would think the GO8 universities would probably be more so because of that drive for research excellence that is so pronounced. One more thing I'd have to say is coming to you mentioned HDRs and how we train them. So I did my PhD at the business school at UQ, and even though I was very aware of the fact that there were still no metrics to value a lot of this work, even getting an interview for a position, let alone actually getting the position itself or getting promoted, that was made quite clear to me. The university narrative and the faculty narrative was, this is coming. We need to do this. We need to work with industry. We need to work collaboratively across the university. And I think, ECAs and PhDs are switched on. They know that there's what's been happening in the past and this is what's coming. And for their career, they need to be on top of what's coming and they need to be prepared and skilled up for that. So that may have fed into my insanity around stuff, what's going to get me the next job. I'm just going to do this because I value it. I think it's important. And I know that this is what's going to be valued in the future. There's a bit of then maybe a period where you've got to just make sure you're still around to get the benefits.
Survive the current until the situation changes. Yeah, I mean, certainly we are seeing globally that impact is being increasingly recognised as an important and valuable part, and that things are slowly changing, shifting in that direction. So hopefully that'll help drive some of the change. Just a very quick comment, I mean, around leadership. At this university, there's a world-leading leadership program, the 5R leadership program, which is very much about social identity in groups, and it's very much a we leadership program. If you check it out, you'll see they're one of the only sort of evidence-based leadership programs, and your success determines on the team, not the individual. So it's not about the leadership, the leader, and what they're great at. It's about how does that team function. So there are examples. I did ask them why everyone at this university doesn't get to do that program, and they said that's a long story. So I guess we'll just have to continue having that conversation, and maybe it's something else we can build into some of the other big challenges we've discussed here today. So thank you for a great question. We're really going to have time for one more question from the online group, and I thought it was a great question. So this is the final one to wrap things up, and it really gets to the core of this, where the question is, where do you draw the line for co-design research? Is there a context we can not apply this approach? And what degree or level of involvement do you need to have to actually declare the approach as co-design? So it's really getting into that whole, what actually makes co-design versus another kind of research. And I don't necessarily think, we've already spoken about the fact that there is no one size fits all. It's not to say this is co-design, and if you're doing it, great. And if you're not doing it. I think it is quite a fuzzy contextual definition, but at the same time, there are some attributes or qualities of co-design that you would say, yeah, this does look and feel and smell like co-design. So it'd be great to hear from the panel what you guys think makes a co-design research project.
I actually don't use the term. I don't know about anybody else, but
that's fine. You don't have to.
So you could probably, in hindsight, describe something you think was well and come up with some characteristics thereof. So that would be that the sort of context setting with large numbers of people tick the box, participatory engagement in some of the particular key milestones and review points tick the box, a wider engagement across a number of disciplines tick the box. But I actually don't approach it that way. So I don't really, it sounds like actually an engineer's question, but can you define this precisely? And then we can measure.
What are you actually doing?
So it's a great question, but I would address it that way. Go back and tick some boxes and see. Oh, that's the reason.
I think it's a very valid way of answering.
Theory, let's say.
No, I think that look at what you've done, reflect on it, and say this is what we think it really made the difference here. And the fact that you mentioned having that diverse set of stakeholders that are actually involved in making key decisions at the end of the day, because if they're not helping design and shape what you're doing, then I think it'd be hard to argue that it is co-design.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing here is the language. So in a business, there's different terms as well: engaged scholarship, action research. There's a whole variety of different forms of action research. The whole book on trying to look at the different types of action research. So I, might call it participatory action research, so that that particular how some people define that anyway.
Been around for a while.
Yeah, and co-design, obviously. So again, I'm probably, I just do what I think needs to be done to solve that particular problem. And then if it looks like it could fit in co-design, then maybe someone calls it co-design, but I'm less.
It doesn't really matter whether it is or not, as long as you.
Yeah, I think a lot of the lessons too, obviously there would be some things that would be more co-design than others in terms of whatever definition you would put on it, but a lot of the things we've talked about today, I think, are relevant across the board. However you define it, whichever category it fits in, probably a lot of what we've talked about is relevant, yeah, across multiple styles of that, whatever we call it, action research, engaged scholarship.
Yeah, as you're speaking, there's obviously a spectrum from participatory in just the framing part, all the way to delivering, if you like, in a lab, someone coming into the lab and tweaking notes for you, right? So there's obviously a hell of a range that you could put into that, from participatory at context level to design, to running it, to review, and to implementation and deployment.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe there is a scale for that kind of engagement somewhere. I read once.
And at the end of the day, if we're trying to create solutions that will have good outcomes and create impact at scale, if that's what we're looking to do, people can call it what they want. Yeah.
As long as we're having impact.
Yeah.
Changing the world.
Impact that's going to be, have the right outcomes, which obviously, then requires that integration of different stakeholders.
Cool. Thank you. Any comments from this side?
I don't use the word and I don't really know what it means.
Common thing.
That's right. I think I do see, I always see a decision tree and I assume there's some publications out there in the social science literature that actually tries to diagnose the issue you're dealing with and leads you down an alternative set of pathways that various versions. And that certainly can be useful. I think most of us at the table have just worked out what suits us based on how things happen and what we learn from other people and whether or not it works. So that said, there is, I think, some benefit as this thing comes together. I'm sure there's a big literature somewhere in the social sciences is having a cheat sheet of terminology and a little bit of these are your circumstances. Maybe this is what you would start doing first. That would be handy. And whether what labels we put on, I don't mind too much. But my ability to learn new words has dropped pretty much to zero.
We certainly teach an old dog some new tricks.
If possible.
Laurie?
The question is really interesting because in some ways, for me, co-design is just a method. But for me, I think it's the way I see the world and the way that I engage in the world, and everything is actually around co-design. I had a performance review yesterday, and we were talking about what we're going to do for the next 6 months, because that's a critical time for some things that are happening. And that, in my world, was co-design too, because that was contributing to the things that we're going to do with industry, and we're building on it. So your supervisor builds on the co-design of the things that you're doing. I'll then take that conversation out to the group, and then we build and we build and we build. So, and the only time I would ever use the term co-design is if I'm writing a grant and I'm actually putting a specific methodology in it. But again, you would use different methodologies to solve different problems. So I think it's just the way you see the world and the way you engage in the world and how you value others' opinions and how they do. So from my supervisor through to the Institute here to Bronwyn and Rachel and you and everyone here, that's part of all we do and how we co-design. So I kind of think everyone, you listen and you incorporate it in. And so I think it's a way of life, and then you use specific methodologies at different times for what you need.
Okay, thank you. One thing we've discussed with GCI is writing a handbook, a guidebook of sorts to sort of summarize what it is, how we do it, tips, cheat sheets, principles, that kind of thing. And whether we call it co-design or whatever, I think is maybe not the most important point. It's really, if you're going to try and do this research, co-design this research with impact, how do you do it? What are some of the things we could learn? So I think this discussion would be, probably watch this at some point and write some notes. And should also point out, this is going to be the first of many panels we'll be having on this topic. So there's already one book for next month where we'll have a similar discussion around co-designing impactful research. So stay tuned for that one, but we're going to have to wrap this one up now. I'd like everyone to thank the panel members for their time and their insights. Fantastic. And thank you to Ron and Whitney and the broader GCI team for helping pull this together, and Bronwyn for her support. For those online, I'm afraid this is where you'll be leaving us, but for those who are here, we have until 12 o'clock. So there's a few minutes if you do want to stick around and maybe grab one of the panels quickly for a quick discussion, and we're welcome to do so. But otherwise, thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, have a great day.